Yay. Okay, so it's time to start. Thank you everyone for joining us for the webinar. We're so excited to welcome the spring season, a time for planting seeds, tending to soil, intentional growth with this idea of accountability to reconciliation, what that means. So the real core of this webinar comes from in this era of reconciliation, we've had so many programs, so many conferences, so many panels, so many opportunities for us to learn. And Indigenous leaders have shared so much of their wisdom, their emotion, their passion with us. And so after an experience that we had as a collective at the Banff Centre, we decided we would think about that and think about how we're gonna pay that forward and hold ourselves accountable with our peers, our work and systems. So I'm ready to jump in, and I'm really happy to have all my panelists here. So yeah. So to begin, I'm going to say where I'm calling in from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin people on land that I'm honored to call home as a settler now. And our webinar panelists and partners are joining from the traditional territory of the Huron, Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas and the New Credit. Today we'll be talking about how to drive momentum from inspiration and learning to action by holding yourselves, your friends, and colleagues and systems accountable. So a little bit about the program that we took part in. So in October, the Banff Centre of Arts and Creativity shared an opportunity with the Circle to invite a cohort of philanthropic peers to participate in the Reconciliation and Rights Relations program. This intensive advanced training program involved experiential learning from partners in ceremonies, in-person lectures, outdoor walks and experiences. It was very wholesome. It left us with a ton of emotion, a ton of learning, and we're excited to share that today. So with us, we have Holly McClellan, Marnie Grona, and Sonia Dayal. Together, we worked on the Circles of Accountability webinar and art series. The art series link will be put into the link in the chat, so you'll see that soon. I'd like to begin with the panelists. So could you please begin with your name, introduce yourselves, where you work, and the work that you do. Holly, I think that you might be muted.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Holly McClellan. I live in Toronto. I'm a settler of Dutch and Irish descent. I grew up in the Niagara region on land in between the escarpment and Lake Ontario, land that is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, and is directly adjacent to the Haldimand Treaty Territory. And my parents still live there. I'm the Executive Director for the Youth and Philanthropy Initiative Canada, or YPI for short. We are a national grant-making organization that sits really at a unique intersection of the Canadian philanthropic, education, and nonprofit sectors. Our mission is to provide immediate support for diverse social justice issues across the country, but to do it in a way that contributes to longer-lasting systemic change. And so we run a multi-award-winning secondary school project across the country that invites teenagers to connect directly with the professionals working on social issues in their own communities. A huge thank you to all of the charity professionals who engage with our students every year. I'm learning more and more. Our whole team is learning more and more about what YPI's role in reconciliation is. As an organization, we can make sure that all of us, our staff, have time at work to spend on understanding our personal and professional role and deepening our commitment to reconciliation. As a grant maker, we have an obligation to really deepen the work that we can support in pushing progress inside philanthropy. And as an educator, we're also looking at our curriculum, our resources, and our evaluations to address the gaps in our participating students' and teachers' knowledge about Indigenous history and rights. And so that's sort of part of where we're starting our journey.
Great. And I guess over to me. So my name is Marnie Grona. I live in Toronto. from family stories and recently confirmed by Ancestry DNA, I'm a settler of Ukrainian and Eastern European descent. I grew up in Thunder Bay, which is in northwestern Ontario, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Métis in the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory. Many of my family members still live there, and I visit quite often. I'm the director of strategic communications with Imagine Canada, and Imagine Canada, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is a national umbrella organization that works to strengthen charities and nonprofits in Canada. Specifically, we strive to influence and work within the systems that many of our organizations operate. And we do this through a number of initiatives, programs, services, sector research, as well as public policy and advocacy work aimed at both the sector organizations and the general public. Now, for reconciliation, Imagine Canada is in the early stages of figuring out how best to support or advance reconciliation for itself, as well as among the nonprofit sector organizations. Recognizing some organizations have been leading in this area for quite some time, while others haven't considered reconciliation at all. So for Imagine Canada's own part, our process began about a year ago, and we've been having discussions with organizations like the Circle, various Indigenous leadership, and others within the sector. And we decided through this process that we need to take some time to consider and reflect where our role is. And now we're just days away from having our first joint board and staff gathering, a reconciliation task force that we have brought together. And the goal is to further discuss, consult, and invite members of the Indigenous community to be part of the process, make recommendations to our national board about the ideal action role that Imagine Canada and the charitable sector can play in reconciliation.
Hi everyone, my name is Sonia Dayal. I am a settler of South Asian and British descent. I was born and raised in Toronto, so the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the 10 First Nations, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and territory subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. My position, I'm a regional director at the Ontario Trillium Foundation, or OTF, to shorten things. And so I'm a regional director in the central area. And just for those who don't know, OTF is a grant maker, one of the largest grant makers in Canada. And we are an agency of the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport. So our investment strategy is around making investments in communities across Ontario to build healthy, vibrant communities. We also run the Local Poverty Reduction Fund and the Youth Opportunities Fund and provide capacity building support through the province through our Services to Community program. In terms of reconciliation, OTF was one of the signatories to the Philanthropic Declaration of Action. And I think we've benefited greatly through being connected with the Circle, and last year begun some of our work around reconciliation and how we were going to live up to that, the signing of the Declaration of Action by forming an affinity group, which was a staff team that really looked at what would it take for us to get there, what are some of the steps that we could take. Those recommendations have gone to our senior leadership and board of directors, and I'll talk a little bit later about some of that work and what we've done. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all. I feel like I should mention that this has been an incredible, from beginning in October till now, it's been incredible to be with this cohort of people. I think that we couldn't have extended the invitation to a better, more succinct and together group. And so I just want to remind everyone that you can actually write your questions in the chat box. We will have a question and answer period at the end, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. So ready to jump in. After an intensive program like the one we went through with the Reconciliation Relations program, how do you transition back into work life after such an intensive 24, almost long days is what I'm trying to say, but how do you get back in and from when you're only focused on reconciliation and back into the system and back into the professional space? Sonia, I think maybe you could take that one.
Sure. So I have to say that the program was something I'd never experienced in my life. I felt it was life-changing. I found that when I was interacting with colleagues, I'd hear, through email, how's the conference? And it was really hard to put into words how different from anything else I'd ever been to it was. I felt lucky that I was able to take the time to separate from work and from family and other obligations and really be fully immersed in this truly experiential. And as Shereen said, it was intense. They were long days. But I felt like I couldn't miss a minute of it. I felt, we were vulnerable, we learned, we shared, and it was just truly life changing. And so then coming back to work, it felt almost like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So how do you bring some of that back into a workplace where we work differently? And so it was calling into question sort of how do we work and what structures do we work in, and when do we smudge, and when do we have the reflective time? It was really different. And one thing that I did feel was encouraged that we at OTF had started this work, and so I felt like I had a place to then be able to start to channel some of that energy and that thinking and that learning. I learned so much from the other participants, from the facilitators, from the elders. And so for me, it's been a process of trying to keep pieces of that fired up energy and that learning and bring it into the day-to-day and not revert back to the day-to-day, because I feel that this work and what I've learned constantly calls me to question some of those ways of working and the kind of normal day-to-day work. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, thank you. And Marnie, building off of that, of Sonia's answer, did you face any barriers returning? I remember you mentioned a culture shock a few months back. Yeah.
Yeah, it was definitely a culture shock. After being so deeply immersed in the experience and having that privilege to be away from your regular day-to-day. Before returning to work, I did have the weekend to myself, and I did have a feeling of being a stranger in my own life and watching the world kind of buzz around as it normally does, as it tends to do, everybody doing their own thing. And feeling disconnected from it, and missing the people in the community that within that week came together quite a lot within that week. I remember having a feeling on being on the Toronto streetcar and just sitting there and just feeling in this space and just kind of looking at people and like, wake up, Canada! Like you have to kind of see what's going around, happening around you. So it was just really weird. There was this really strong awakening and a stranger in my own life. That feeling did extend back into work, and it was challenging communicating my experiences and learnings to colleagues who are very much, again, into the groove of their usual work. Even with colleagues who are very much want to advance and understand reconciliation, it was a challenge kind of describing that to them. And I also noticed something else. I felt really protective about reconciliation and reconciliation related discussions or formal processes people wanted to use in their approach to reconciliation. Feelings of, but you don't understand, or no, you can't approach it this way, and just trying to articulate these things. And I think I was lucky that since Banff, at a staff retreat, and the closest that I felt to the Banff experience and dynamic was when we hosted the Kairos blanket exercise at our recent staff retreat. It was after that experience where I think I had most most meaningful connections and conversations with colleagues. So I do think that having those shared immersive experiences are very important to the reconciliation process.
Yeah, and I think that's so special as well. I think bringing the Kairos blanket exercise into the workplace, bringing programs like that into the workplace, and you get to create a culture and an understanding between each other, and a similar bond to the one that we have, which leads to the whole accountability to each other idea of things. Holly, leaving Banff, we all felt courageous and fueled to make change. Did you continue the conversations we were talking about when we were at the program? And did you use those conversations to start action or plan for action?
Yeah, absolutely. Something that hit me pretty hard in Banff was the sheer amount of emotional privilege I have, among other privileges. I've always had the option to just check out whenever I feel overwhelmed by the weight of the news, the latest mass injustice, the doublespeak that I feel enraged by, but that won't directly impact the way my children and I are going to eat and sleep and be safe in Toronto that night. Our society provides endless encouragement and avenues for privileged people to check out. And just to be clear, I don't mean to equate checking out with self-care, which I think is different and really important. In Banff, what really stuck with me was the conversation and the lives of Elder Sykes and Elder Dyla and all the facilitators, Cynthia, Rye, Lexi, and Erin, how long their resistance has been, what they've seen and what they've felt, the toll it takes to resist and struggle and make real change in your communities that can never check out. And I think in this way, it's really important to open yourself up to those conversations that help you develop a really honest connection that will sustain your commitment and accountability to reconciliation. And especially if you've been on the beneficiary side of injustice in Canada. And something actually just happened this week with one of my colleagues that reminded me of how important it is to keep conversations going and follow them through, especially when they get really uncomfortable. I was talking with one of my really close colleagues, and I was just about this webinar and preparing for it, and I just to be frank, I was a bit raw in my reaction to her very practical suggestion that people on the webinar would need like next steps, like easy ways to do the next thing in reconciliation. Let's make it easy. And I was like, why can't they just Google it? Why do we have to keep making things easy? Like we need to take responsibility. And we're really close, and she just really gently reminded me, like, if people on the webinar are anything like her, then it's going to really sit with everyone for a couple of hours. You might have a conversation or two, and then you get pretty quickly involved in the rest of your life, in your day-to-day, and taking care of your children and making your house happen, your home life happen. And in that moment, I realized the other privilege I had is actually spending time at work doing this as an ED. And the fact that I got to go to Banff and really immerse myself in this experience, and the fact that I got to, the only reason I knew the treaty territory, the treaty covering the territory I grew up on, is because I took 20 minutes at work to research it. We were robbed of this time growing up that should have been in our own education. And so what I realized is, as the leader of my organization, time is something I can give my team, something that we can actually put time into our working lives to make sure that we all have the opportunity to really personally dig in and do the studying, do the research, and have a bit of a sort of small circle of accountability within our own team. So we're all really excited to do that. We'll use the TRC's calls to action, as well as resources from the Circle and other amazing organizations that are working across the country to really frame our personal and professional accountability and check in with each other. So I think it's really important for us to recognize, as people holding leadership positions in organizations and people being leaders, no matter what your role in your organization, that this will take time. So personal transformation takes time, but the time to start is now, like right now. There are big actions for us to be a part of that are going to require some deep engagement across the country. The Bill C-262 by MP Romeo Saginash is just passed its second reading. This will actually try to get the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples actually adopted and implemented in Canada. The TRC, 10 of the 94 calls to action have been successfully completed since over the last 3 years. So there's 84 more to go. You can actually go on to CBC just launched a site called Beyond 94, where you can actually track them and see where you can connect and align your personal journey with reconciliation to what's needed at a systems level as well, and see where you can contribute. And of course, the legacy of colonialism and residential schools or forced indoctrination schools actually continues today. Human rights abuses are happening today. We need to show up and make a commitment to keep learning, take the time, and do the work to understand what our education system has so treacherously not taught us. Don't wait for, don't rely on, or expect Indigenous people to take the time and energy to speak it for you. But we can all support each other through these circles and through the values that we share.
Yeah, thank you so much, Holly. I think the biggest thing is that the seeking out Indigenous knowledge actively is so important, and to continue your learnings even after it's shared with you. It's not enough to be in that space and then leave and then expect the information to keep coming at you. You need to actively look at it and take that time. I think that you captured that so well. And so in that though, in finding your answers in that, there's this nervousness sometimes where you're like, well, did I find the right answer? Or am I taking the right course of action on the information that I found online? Sonia, how do you think, or how would you address the nervousness and your nervousness that organizations might feel when starting to work towards reconciliation?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's lots of different reasons why organizations feel nervous. I think it's partially people feeling afraid to do or say the wrong thing, to offend. I think people feel overwhelmed, it's too big, where to start, and how does it fit? As I said, when I came back from Banff and thinking, how does it fit? How do we, this is what we do as an organization, how do we make sense of and reconcile really the recommendations with what we do? So I think some of the things that are really important are, organizations taking the time to help their staff and or volunteers understand the truth. So I think, there's things like the blanket exercise, which we just did this week with our staff team, whole staff team, as well as we did a visit to Woodland Cultural Center. So building in the time and over time to be able to do that learning and understand the truth and get a common understanding of what's happening and have the time, as Holly said. Not all organizations will have that, but if there's that time to be able to offer for staff to do this learning, I think it's also really important that organizations recognize the importance of partnerships and working with Indigenous communities. So, you could look online or you could try to find the right box to check or the right information, but really if you've got partnerships and you're working with Indigenous communities towards your organization getting there, then you're going to have a better chance of success and not, you're working side by side. I think there's also needs to be a real commitment from leadership to that this is what we're doing as an organization, and if that happens, then there is the time and resources and intentionality behind it, and that it's not a box to check. It's not something we're going to do and then check it off this year. That it's a long-term process that we might make mistakes. We're not going to get it all the first time, but that we need to be cognizant that that's what it takes, and that we're in it for the long haul. And I think there's things that you can do to start with that don't see they're significant and they're intentional, but they may be some things that you can do starting today, like land acknowledgements, for example. So we've started doing land acknowledgements at our meetings, at our outreach events, at our grantee recognition events. So there's things like that. I think sometimes organizations can feel challenged to look at the whole organization. You may need to challenge yourself and the policies that you have or the ways that you work or who's on your staff and volunteers. And those are tough questions. So I think it's a willingness to do that type of examination to really make change and have uncomfortable conversations, have the time and space to have those uncomfortable conversations in order to move forward. So those are just some of the things that come to mind for me in the work that we're doing at OTF.
Yeah, and being so close with OTF and also watching the development in conversation with you, it's really exciting. And I think back to a couple weeks ago when I came to the OTF offices and you have that mask right in the lobby, and like talk about bringing that into the space. And it may be uncomfortable when you read it and you'll have feelings, but it's there, and you're jolting people to be like, well, we're intentionally doing work here. And there is that obvious intention. Which is so beautiful in itself, just as an organization in this work. Marnie, I know the process of you creating your circles of accountability art piece. When we started it, you felt a similar sense of nervousness where you weren't even sure if you were going to do the art piece after a few weeks, and then you committed to it again. Do you see that parallel with the organization and how an organization moves through this work?
Yeah, absolutely. For me in creating this piece, behind me, it was a lot of reflection. I struggled with my place of privilege, much like what Holly touched on. Asking who am I within this to create this piece and to share it. It's easy to get stuck in your inner dialogue or the cycles of discussions that tend to happen and not move forward at all. That whole moving into action is something that we're really holding on to and trying to keep going in our circles of accountability. And then for me, I just got to a point where I just had to dive in and come from a place with as much respect and understanding that I could bring to the table. Acknowledging my shortfalls, acknowledging that I might make a mistake, and acknowledging the fact that I will learn from that, and that's okay. So I think that that same nervousness for other people or other organizations stems from fear of making a mistake or a misstep, having the feeling of having that perfect approach and process in place. For a lot of us in the nonprofit sector, we have a lot of processes that we put in place to how that we want to do things. That's hard to break out of that, to come at an issue and reconciliation in a different frame of mind. So, it can be a risk, having that fear. It can be a risk for an organization to get involved with the reconciliation space, but I think we're at the point where it's more of a risk for organizations not to, or at least acknowledge it in some way. I understand that many organizations have specific mission sets, and reconciliation within those missions can be quite the shift, if not a real struggle, because for some organizations, they may find that there are parts in their history that they may not like or be ready to confront, but I think they will need to in order to move forward, and they need to see themselves within that. The main thing I think is like how I, with this painting, is just start, and that's where I got to. It was just start. The acts can be small. I focused on a small part of the painting, went to the next part, built on it, stood back, reflected. Okay, what's the next move? What do I do from here? And then for organizations, it's the small things. It's learning about the territorial land on which you reside, doing acknowledgements, providing opportunities for staff. The main thing is being intentional, and that each intentional act builds on one another and makes progress.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think to add is just that in that process of moving through the nervousness, what we're learning about ourselves, where we stand personally and where we stand professionally, is also a reconciliation journey. It's seeing that privilege, it's becoming an ally. And it is part of the process that we did go through with the webinars that started with the personal to community to now the professional. It's all moving through this nervousness, this uncomfortableness in a way that's intentional and continuing. And it's not pausing, it's a continued accountability to continue the work, and you'll never really be done until, you know, who knows? That's not the point. It's just the process is so important as well. So that question touched on the Circle of Accountability art series, which stemmed from a conversation that I had with Chris on accountability. And so when I came back, I was talking to Chris, she's like, what did you do in Banff? And I had this, I threw everything at her. I was like, everything, I don't know, because I was just so caught up in emotion and trying to unpack it. But what came out was clear was that we were so attached to one another. We built such relationships with Elder Sykes, Elder Dyla, with Alexia, with each other, with all the people that were participating in our cohort, which was around, I don't really know, but 30 people or around there. And in that, in maintaining these friendships, we've been able to connect over a period of time now, and talk about what's happening and certain things that are changing, and ways that we're still holding each other accountable. Like, did you see that in the news? What was your reaction to that? What is your organization doing in response? It's just this constant back and forth. And in asking each other, we're reminding each other, but we're also keeping each other accountable to be like, oh, well, did you really not see that? Or whatever it was. As non-Indigenous people, that's kind of the role that we take to each other, is just to keep that going. Holly, I know you have a deep reflection on the importance of accountability and who you're accountable to. Can you share that with everyone, please?
Yeah, I just wanted to say as well, this this whole process of the art series, doing this webinar 6 months after the course has been such a powerful way to experience accountability, and I feel so connected to all of you, and I just thank you all so much. It's just been extraordinary. One of the comments I think one of the facilitators made in the course that really I emphasized in my notes, that I read through as I was creating the spoken word as part of the art series, was we're still trying to share, we're still trying to get this relationship right. And this came from the Indigenous perspective of, we've been sharing it since you got here, we've been saving your lives, and we're still trying to get this relationship right. It really sits with me. I feel like this is such a critical period of time that we're in right now. Indigenous peoples, survivors of Canada's genocide, and the same people who continue to be impacted by its legacy of abuse and structural violence, are healing, and at the same time leading us to where we need to be as a country. And it's a lot to expect, and I think it's obviously wrong to expect that. I think there's some statistics around engagement in reconciliation across Canada, and something like 30% are really engaged, want to see reconciliation happen. 30% are not engaged, they don't care, they don't want to, they have no interest, and 40% are on the fence. And so what we need to do is actually keep adding to this critical mass of Canadians across the country who are invested in the work of reconciliation in Canada, and who will keep each other accountable to making the UN DRIP, the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the rest of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action a reality. Accountability is so important because a lot of big talk and empty gestures have been happening for centuries, and honest conversations are really important to our personal transformation, but they need to be made meaningful by actions that contribute to the work at hand. Just reflecting on the sense of accountability I feel to this small group and to everyone that we went through the course with in Banff, I think you just naturally feel the most accountable to the people and the values with whom you share a strong relationship with. And so caring for and developing those relationships will be an integral part of reconciliation. We can bring the values of reconciliation to the circles that you're already strongly tied to, as well as build strong relationships with new circles that will value reconciliation and to help you keep accountable to it. There's about 100 people on this webinar from, I'm assuming, maybe 100 organizations across the country, and imagine what we can do by taking the time to be really accountable and bring the values of reconciliation into our strong ties. and of our organizations and our own families. And the circles I feel really strongly connected to and accountable to are my team at YPI, to Kate and Rachel and Sneha. The small team that I feel super connected to, the steering committee at Resource Movement, who I recently joined, the students and teachers at Banff, including everyone on this panel, as I mentioned. I also feel accountable to my children and their future and the communities of their future. And as I was reflecting on this, even to my own ancestors who came to Canada wanting a better life for their children, and not for their children to be part of a dishonest and violent system of oppression. So I feel like there's an accountability to their legacy as well, that I'm still wrestling with. I just feel like I really need to be part of making this relationship right. And I think part of the, some of the pre-readings that really resonated with me was, the course was on the circle of courage. And so it's the sort of 4 foundational pieces of well-being, being belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. And so it's all sort of rooted in belonging, and part of belonging is being accountable to the values of that group, and being grounded in that sense of belonging can support your development in the other areas, allowing you to develop the mastery, the independence, the generosity that we need as we walk this path of reconciliation. We are starting an accountability, we've started an accountability circle with the Banff group as well. And so we did a 6-week check-in. We've got a 6-month check-in coming up in April. And sort of it's still work in progress, but we're seeing as sort of the hallmarks of what matters to people in an accountability circle is really being able to keep a connection alive with people that you have this sense of purpose with. The second being able to share wise practices, frameworks, additional resources for learning, and as Shereen mentioned, the keeping each other kind of in the loop on things as they unfold, and inspiring each other to action. And then also there's some opportunities for helping mobilize to contribute to system level change. So doing maybe some rapid response and looking at what's happening in the news. There were some great sort of calls out to the philanthropic community recently after the injustices in the Colton Bushi and Tina Fontaine cases. And it was just almost like a reminder to the philanthropic community of what they've committed to by signing the declaration to the circle. And so those are really great examples of how to stay connected and accountable to the communities that you belong to.
Thank you, Holly. And everything you've shared is so valuable. And I think a few resources have come up as we've been talking. And just so the audience knows, we will be sharing a resources page after with links and names and things that have been mentioned in case you want to follow up and begin that or continue the work that you're doing with your organizations. And Holly touched here a little bit on the circles of accountability idea. And what the circle is also thinking of starting one or in development of a circle of accountability with people who can just call on. It's a conference call. You can call in from wherever and just have this open dialogue and sharing and keeping each other accountable. And so if you're interested in that and joining that, we will be adding a link into the survey that goes out for you to add your email address. And then as it develops, we'll keep you updated in the loop and make sure that you know when it's starting and if you want to join. So before we move into question period, I have one question, and I hope that all 3 of you can answer it. And it's, what do you think the most important thing to share with people in the nonprofit sector, like related to accountability and moving through with the action, following through with action?
I think I'm first. Okay. So I think it's a lot of what we've touched on already. It's you know, as a country, we've signed on to fulfill the calls to action, and so our organizations all operate within the space of that. And so it's looking at, what are we going to do as a sector, whether that be the way the spaces in which we work, and also how do we fulfill our missions as organizations if we don't. So I think it's a matter of organizations starting to take a look at them and figuring out sort of where they can start. We talked earlier about the discomfort, about the challenges and the things that are really helpful to have in place to be able to move forward as an organization. So the leadership commitment and the time and resources to be able to learn. But I think for organizations that aren't there, you can start with yourself. So I think, as an individual, if you're not in that place in your organization, to be able to commit yourself to being able to start to learn, to being able to reflect yourself and have a personal plan of action, but also be able to find allies in your organization. So if you're not there yet to be able to have a plan or a task force, to at least be able to find allies and to be able to start to have those conversations within your organizations. And I think just going back to Holly's point about the 40% that are undecided, it's also about then having those conversations in your different circles. So, you're having those conversations in your organizations, but you're having conversations at home with your family, with your people that you're connected to in your community, because I think that's also our opportunity to have that dialogue and foster more understanding about what those calls to action mean and what we've committed to as a country. So it's the organization level, it's the sector level, but it's the community level and the personal level that are all important. And I think, one's not more important than the other. I think they're all important in moving us forward and to start where we're at rather than be immobilized and think we can't do anything. So that's one of my big takeaways.
I think for me, for what I would have to share with people in the nonprofit sector, especially if you're new to this and before moving an organization to action level, something that you want to do or do in tandem with is what we've all kind of touched upon at different parts of this webinar, is to start with your own personal reconciliation and help colleagues and employees define their connections. I think that's our responsibility to help others through the process, especially for those of us who've gone through it. It's kind of pass it on. Look for immersive opportunities. They can be with Banff or host a Kairos blanket session, at a staff retreat or a gathering. If you host conferences for the nonprofit sector, have those experiences embedded for your attendees to kind of help to bridge it on. Also connect with your community, connect with Indigenous groups, follow reconciliation leaders on social media, go to talks, sign up for newsletters, and take your time, but don't be too slow about it. As Holly said, this has been a long going process and we are now catching up, and I think we need to catch up faster than what Canada has done in the past, especially those who are in the settler descent. Take your time, but be intentional and just keep moving forward. Don't get caught up in perfection paralysis of trying to have everything perfect and not to make mistakes. Just intentional, move forward.
Unmute. Something that's really hopeful, I saw Max Finday share a stat about almost 80%, about 79% of millennials believe that meaningful reconciliation can happen in their lifetime. If you're feeling resistance in your organization, talk to the young people in your organization. We see this in the students that we work with YPI. They are up for it. They want to do this. They want to make this happen. Reconciliation is going to be an ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships between people, but as well as every part of the natural world. Something that really resonated with me through the land-based experience that we had in Banff was that if we continue to destroy the earth, reconciliation is incomplete. The message that I got from Banff was really that the overculture is making us all pretty sick. And we as settlers also have a lot of healing to do, and being personally accountable and honest about the work ahead will help not only us, but the future that we're trying to create together. And we have to walk this path together, and we belong to it together.
Yeah, thank you all. I think that it's been so great to work with you all on this, because I've seen the action that's coming out of it, out of the program, and I'm really honored to have been to be close enough to you to see that happen, and hope that in sharing what we've shared today and starting accountability circles, and that we can start to see that and be aware of all of the other nests that are happening and start to link them a little bit more, because that's where the power is, in sharing that idea and holding each other. So we're ready for question period now, and I'm going to do my best to look at them on my phone. So the first question that we have is advice for getting your executives and boards on board with reconciliation. And I think that if anyone ever feels they're ready to answer the question, just pop up your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to nominate. And so, Holly, why don't you start us with that one?
Sure. Well, so the question was, how do you bring on the executive and your board?
Yeah.
Well, speaking as, so I've been the executive director of YPI for 18 months now, and so I'm still pretty new to this position and to finding my own path in reconciliation. But I think the experiences that have given me the confidence have been the sort of direct, really intense experiences in Banff, and then really having groups of people that I can be accountable to as I go through my own personal reconciliation itself, like really understanding the history of the land that my own family occupied and was part of the colonial project, you know. So I think that having opportunities for your exec to deeply engage with these issues and be moved by the truth of what's happened in our country, and just keeping in mind that, you know, I was in primary school in the 90s and I didn't learn about this stuff. Like, this is very recent. We have not learned about this history at all. So I think like there just has to be opportunities for education and experience, and being open to a real emotional connection to this work, an ethical connection to this work. I think the Brookings Institute kind of put out something about the future of board competencies are going to be around climate, sustainability, and Indigenous competencies. So these are really future forward competencies that boards need to keep an eye out for. And so it's a very long answer to that question, but it's something that's definitely still a work in progress on our side. We recently had a strategic planning retreat where we just started to introduce the commission calls to action to our board itself. So we're very early in this process, but it's having the courage to have those conversations and being accountable to people that value it as well, I think really help.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. And I hope that you gave a good answer. It's very wholesome. So I hope that you've given some good ideas there. The next question we have is for Sonia. As a funder, we want to be to ensure our granting process is as open and accessible to all. Are there any practical solutions to changing, updating granting processes to ensure Indigenous groups can apply?
Yeah, great question. Some of what came out of, I mentioned earlier that we had an affinity group that looked at kind of how can we honor our commitments as an organization that we made to the Declaration of Action. So there were a number of recommendations that really tackled a number of areas of the organization, everything from policy to cultural competency to processes and systems. And so some of the things that we started to do and are continuing to do is take a look at what are some of the systemic barriers that might be in place. So for example, you know, things as simple as doing proactive outreach and engagement to targeted communities, targeted Indigenous communities, to ensure that we're reaching people where they're at, so that they can understand how to apply to, you know, helping people see themselves in what we fund, to providing direct coaching and support to organizations who are looking to apply, particularly around Indigenous organizations and projects benefiting Indigenous communities. And moving forward, one of the things that we're looking at is looking directly at our process, so looking at our assessment process and our decision-making process to see where there may be opportunities to look at how we weight things, so that if we want, you know, what gets measured gets done. So if we want to make more grants, for example, to organizations and to initiatives benefiting Indigenous communities, then we need to reflect that in our assessment process. So that's something that we're looking at right now. But just as a result of some of our intentional actions, we have seen an increase in the grants going to Indigenous communities just this last year. We still have a lot of work to do. The other piece of that again is around the cultural competency and learning that our staff and volunteers need to have to be able to understand then when they're assessing and making decisions about grants, why this matters and why make a grant, you know, why assess a grant this way, and how it fits with our investment strategy, and look at biases and things like that. So that's all part of the process.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I think to add to this, for the Ontario Indigenous Youth Partnership Project, I know that we take and the Circle and Tides Canada have kind of worked on that together with a lot of partners and Indigenous youth advisors. And every year we come together at the beginning before the launch of the program to talk about our values, like OIP's values. And they change every year so dramatically. The youth advisors as well as the core team come together, and a few of them, like innovation, changed to revitalization this year. And there's a number of them that shift. And I think that having that sit down with Indigenous youth, if the grant is for Indigenous youth, and your core team, just to go over what matters this year, what is our goal this year, is really good, just to keep everything from that point forward set to that set of values that you have. And I'll add the link to the values page of OIP into the resources that we share after. The next question that I'm going to ask is, what was the experience behind the Circles of Accountability art series? What did you create, and what stood out to you the most about translating that learning into art? Holly?
Yeah, this was a really powerful experience. It was a creative exercise that really got us to re-immerse ourselves, our hearts and minds back really completely into a course that had happened months previously. Able to really connect with the materials. I created a spoken word piece that really wove together all my notes from the course. So from the readings, from the facilitators, from amazing pieces of wisdom and ideas from my co-students as well, my peers. And it put me back into the space that I was in Banff, the sort of emotional space, feeling courageous to name the things that happened as they happened and be honest about those things. I really appreciated the opportunity to produce an art piece as a way to reflect. It really did help me to re-experience everything, and it's something I've never done after a conference, after a training. It was something that really reignited everything that I had learned, made me feel actually more confident in my personal connection to reconciliation and more accountable. Yeah.
Thank you, Holly. And in receiving all of the art, I was feeling so incredibly humbled by the talent in this group. Even Allison's piece, who couldn't join us for the webinar. I mean, I think we had an idea, and then when we saw what we got back, we're like, whoa, so talented bunch. Marnie, the last question is for you. The recommendations ask charities to commit to addressing relevant parts of the TRC report in their strategic plans. Can you speak to the impact of that? How can charities truly be accountable for those commitments to Indigenous peoples?
Wow. I think how to be accountable is make space in your day-to-day processes, make space at board meetings to discuss it, make space in staff meetings to discuss it. You know, for us, we've had, we have a short-term, reconciliation task force, which will go forward and make recommendations to then have the future actions that we will take, and we're discovering what those are. Read the call, read the calls to action. I happen to have a small booklet here, and go through and read them and see and identify which of the calls reflect and have the most connections to your organization, and then focus on those. As you say, it is a big reconciliation is big, but it's finding, not necessarily small, but the points where you can connect with the most and can and feel where you can add the most value, and also invite others into your organization. I know we always talk about how we can go out and help, and some of that change is who we bring into the organization. Bring in people of from Indigenous communities, Indigenous leaders. I think that is where will help the seeds that will help charities to start to become more accountable and be more aware of what they're doing in the space of reconciliation.
Thank you. And thanks, Marnie. I think it's awesome that you pulled out the books that we got, because I remember when we got those and thinking, well, that's so neat that you can always just pull it out, and the situation doesn't always come up. So it's really nice when it is there, and to have that with you so that when it does come up, you do have it. And so I know the TRC, I think, post them or mail them. So yeah, how'd you? You're muted. We can't hear you, Marnie.
Sorry. We ordered copies for each of our staff members, each of our board members, and our standards program, standards council members. We have ordered these. So it is to kind of, to keep them close, and you can reach out to the TRC and order them. I believe they're $1 each, and then you just have to organize shipping and handling. They're quite valuable to have.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you, everyone. That time flew by. I'm so happy and thankful that you all joined us to watch, and that thank you to our panelists for sharing their wisdom with the network. I think this has been an incredible experience working with all of you. The Circle has a number of really exciting things coming up, but we're getting close to cut time. So we're sending out a newsletter next week. Please subscribe to it if you're interested in finding out ways to get involved and be a part of the spring programming. There's some really cool and neat stuff. I'll tweet the link to subscribe on the Circle's Twitter account, but I'll also add it to the resources that we'll be sending. For next steps, we'll be sending out a survey for today's webinar, and a recording of this will be posted online along with a list of resources. So you'll be sure to have that early next week.